Okay, so welcome to Section 3 on freedom and equality. So in Section 1, we explored the fundamental question of political authority and what could possibly justify it. In Section 2, we examined two popular answers to what the government should do with that authority, namely promote virtue or promote happiness. Section 3 arises as a response to problems in Section 2. Now, we said in a previous lecture that the modern condition is one where people of different faiths, different values, and different goals in life interact with one another. And with that interaction comes an awareness of the fact that others are very different in the kinds of ethical and political commitments that they have. This is what we refer to as the burdens of judgment. To assume that the state should pursue some idea of happiness or some idea of virtue for its citizens seems to assume that some of these values and goals are superiors to other values and goals. In effect, it seems to assume that some ways of life are objectively better than other ways of life. Yet, if history tells us anything, it's that smart, intelligent, and well-adjusted people seem to be able to find happiness in a variety of different ways, practicing many different religions and many different lifestyles. On what grounds, then, can the state be justified in asserting that some ways of life are better than others, and not just assert it, but actually coercively enforce laws that privilege one way of life over another? One possible answer to this modern dilemma, and one that many of my students seem to believe with a fair amount of intensity, is that the state should retreat from the project of pursuing any particular goals or values. Don't impose your moral convictions on me, they say. If we can't objectively assert that one way of life or system of values is better than another, then, my students say, we should be accepting and respectful of all ways of life and systems of value. And this seems like an obvious response, and it's a kind of postmodern answer, but it's not the only response. Another possible response to the fact of pluralism about ways of life and conceptions of the good is the philosophical tradition of liberalism. This philosophical tradition first arose in England in the 17th and 18th centuries as a response to the bloody religious wars that were going on at the time between Catholics and Protestants. And the liberal idea in a nutshell is that in the absence of a common set of values to live by, we should let people be free to disagree, even when what others are doing, either to their immortal souls or each other, seems rather unpleasant to us. But this liberal idea, which is characteristic of the period in history known as the Enlightenment, which lasted roughly most of the 18th century, is not the same as postmodernism. It asserts that openness to new ideas and tolerance is itself the objectively correct stance, and that as long as your values and ways of life are compatible with openness and tolerance, then you're pretty much free to do as you wish, no matter how much other people might not like what you do. The openness of liberalism is like the openness of scientific inquiry in many ways, and it's not coincidence that these two ideas of scientific inquiry and liberalism arose at the same time in history. The openness of scientific inquiry is based on the idea that you have to stay open to new ideas, new possible theories about the way the world works. And the openness of liberalism is very much the same. You have to stay open to ideas, but neither mean that you have to accept all ideas as equally valid. Let me try to illustrate the difference if it's not entirely clear. I'm going to use an example that I'm taking from Professor Robert Kane at the University of Texas. Imagine you're walking down the street one day and you see a woman being assaulted. You have a choice then. You can intervene or you can just keep on walking like so many people do these days. If you don't intervene, perhaps you're a kind of relativist. Who are you, after all, to interfere with the way of life of the mugger or the rapist? That's his way of life, and you have to treat his values as being equally good to anyone else's values, including the poor woman who's being assaulted. The liberal, or I guess the courageous liberal, would in fact interfere in this situation. Why? Because on the liberal view, the mugger's way of life directly interferes with the liberty of the woman to live her own life. In other words, it interferes with the necessary conditions of an open society, that all be free to pursue their own life as they see fit. And of course, the woman in this case is not free to pursue her own life as she sees fit. She is being assaulted. The liberal says that in these situations, there really is no neutral stance you could possibly take. No matter what you do, you are not going to be neutral. You can do nothing and let the woman's way of life be ruined, or you could interfere with the mugger or the rapist and his way of life. There is nothing, interference or non-interference, either way, you are going to be privileging one set of values over another. The liberal says that neutrality is only appropriate when there are no obvious conflicts of interest. You do your thing, I do my thing. I pursue my religion, you pursue your religion, but my pursuit of my religion doesn't interfere with your pursuit of your religion. In that case, the state can totally remain neutral. But in the case of the mugging and the assault, there's nothing you could do, nothing anybody could do, the state or anyone else, to remain neutral. Non-action is equivalent to taking sides. In this case, non-action is taking sides with the mugger. So, to some of you, this kind of strong moral stance doesn't sound like modern liberal views. But as always in this class, I'm using the term liberal in its philosophical sense, which encompasses actually many modern-day Republicans, Democrats, and libertarians. I'm not using it in the political sense where it designates the left wing of American politics. The left wing of American politics is full of people who are philosophical liberals, to be sure, but it's also full of socialists and utilitarians and postmodernists and communitarians, and so is, by and large, the American right. The philosophical tradition of liberalism is primarily one in tolerance, and this tradition is one that emerged from this religious conflict of the 17th century, 16th and 17th centuries. But just because it emerged as a response to religious conflict doesn't mean that its only domain of application is religion. It can be applied to many kinds of conflicts of values today. Its pillars, you might say, you call them twin pillars, are freedom and equality. The freedom of each to pursue their own happiness and way of life, as long as that pursuit doesn't interfere with the equal freedom of others to do the same. The mugger violates this idea of equal freedom, and this is an ideal that liberals assert as being, in fact, true. So liberalism is not a neutral stance on question of political values, at least philosophical liberalism is not. It's a response to the challenges of increasingly plural societies, and it asserts itself to being a principled and correct response, unlike relativism or postmodernism, which asserts that there's no one response that is better than any other response. Much of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries has been spent working out in theory and in practice what a government committed to individual freedom and equality actually means. How much can be tolerated? Where's the line between public and private? What does equal freedom to pursue happiness actually entail? The reason philosophical liberals are in different political parties today is that they disagree about how exactly to balance freedom and equality, as well as what kinds of political and economic institutions are best suited to the task of balancing freedom and equality. Now, we're not going to be able to work out all these issues in this class or in this section of the class. As I said, this is an ongoing conversation, but we can begin to explore the different strands in thinking about how to balance freedom and equality. We're going to start by looking at different ways we can be free, positively and negatively. Then we're going to look at Thomas Hobbes' proposed solution to moral conflict, and paradoxically, Hobbes' solution, although it sounds like it leads straight to absolute monarchy, and Hobbes thought it did, is actually endorsed by many contemporary theorists of democracy and as a justification for democratic authority. After that, we're going to examine the worth of freedom and equality. What gives freedom and equality its value? What makes it a worthwhile ideal to defend as a principled stance against both relativism and the kind of virtue ethics or perfectionism or utilitarianism endorsed by some of the critics of liberalism. We're going to look at a liberal, Mill, John Stuart Mill, a Marxist, well, a Marxist. We're going to look at Karl Marx, who, yes, is the original Marxist, right? We're going to look at Karl Marx, and then we're going to look at David Schmitz. And David Schmitz is going to kind of try to give us an assessment of what's going on in the debate between liberals and egalitarians like Marx. Finally, we're going to move laterally a little bit and look at Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, who is going to point out the continuing fundamental tension in liberalism between our commitment on the one hand to individual freedom, which is embodied in our traditions of individual rights and our Bill of Rights in the United States, and on the other hand, our commitment to political equality, which is embedded in norms of democracy, of one person, one vote. Now, in looking at the history of liberalism, we're looking in the mirror in a way at the last few centuries of American and European politics. Radical critics on the right and on the left both look at this mirror image and they find it distasteful, they find it ugly. It's full of immoral compromises on important questions of value. It's full of excessive individualism and rampant consumerism. It's full of moral decay, moving away from important value-oriented ways of life. And for critics on the left, it's got a lack of moral courage and progressivism, right? It's a lack of vision. It's uninspiring. Liberalism is just uninspiring because it's a compromise all the time. Philosophical liberals look at this history and they see progress on many fronts. They see more and more freedom and more equality for more and more groups of people, and they think this is by and large a good sign, despite flaws and hiccups along the way. So my question for you is, what do you see?